Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's November 3rd, and Rabbi Mafik, first they came for the Jews.
Yeah, that's where the title comes from, actually. Let's a lot of interesting stuff I want to cover today. I hope everyone is well. Just about a day after, I think the day after our class, I came across an article that was based on a story on NPR, and it had some interesting statistics. It said 1 in 4 American Jews say they experienced anti-Semitism last year. That's incredible. Now, it may not sound like a lot, but that's 1 in 4 over 1 year, which previous statistics, the highest previous year was only 12%. Isn't that interesting? So almost a double. And another interesting part of it was that 39% of American Jews changed their behavior in the past 12 months, such as by avoiding posting online content or wearing items that would identify them as Jewish. 39%. That's higher than I would have expected. I mean, just for curiosity's sake, anyone ever edit yourself and not say something you would normally say because of fear of anti-Semitism? Yeah?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I've done just the opposite.
Okay. That's used to. That's good. So you've spoken up, whereas before you might not have said anything. You might have said, "Oh, let it be." Now you spoke up. That's great. That's great. Others.
Brenda, you had your hand up. Oh, wait a minute.
Oh,
I can.
Sorry, yeah. I've edited some of my comments, not so much that I would be judged to be Jewish, but I think my political contents, I don't necessarily want, some of my friends come on so strong and so negative that I think I've edited my comments in that way.
Well, that's good. Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, in some sense, we're always self-editing a little bit. Like, no one ever says everything that's on their mind. But I think what this is getting at is some people, maybe at one point they would have worn, let's say, a yarmulke. Like if you wear a yarmulke on the subway in New York City, you're liable to get, there are increasing anti-Semitic incidents. And so somebody who may have worn a yarmulke before, let's say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, may not wear one now. Someone may post. College students often feel, and I've talked with them about this, they can't really talk about Israel much on campuses because they'll get drowned out. So there is something to that. Other comments, anyone else had to edit themselves over the last, year or two? Okay, let's keep going then. Okay, so this article is quite interesting. One other part of the article said that Americans actually, 95% of Americans are generally supportive of Israel, like believe in Israel's right to exist, but 90% of American Jews think anti-Semitism is a problem in the country. 90%, that's very high, very high. But while just 60% of the general population said the same. Now that is an interesting divergence. We would anticipate that it would be slightly higher, like the number of Jews who believe anti-Semitism is a problem would always be a little bit higher than the general population, but this is 50% higher. This is 50. So what explains that? Well, probably we are a little bit more sensitive to it, of course. If you're Jewish, you're going to notice anti-Semitism more than if you're not. So again, it's not surprising that it would be so high. Perhaps this reflects, that some anti-Semitism is not covered as much by the media. Even the New York Times admitted that the New York Times has admitted, this was like a year or two ago, I remember doing this for the book, they don't report all the incidents of anti-Semitism that happen. It would just be too much. I mean, there is a lot of, or that could be classified as anti-Semitic, violence against Jews, that they're just, a lot of it just doesn't go reported in broader media. Whereas of course, Jews generally may experience it more. Also, Jews tend to be congregated in urban areas. Most American Jews live in mid-sized to big cities or their environments, the suburbs. So we're just a little bit more attuned to it than the larger population. But this does speak to there being a need to educate about anti-Semitism. So this was an article just last week. Now, a couple of things, what I want to cover today. There's a lot I want to cover today, and I'm sure we won't get through all of it, but I want to look at 5 big explanations for anti-Semitism. I call these the big 5 in the book, and I want to kind of go through each of them. And these kind of at least give us an explanation of what are some of the justifications for anti-Semitism? If you're a historian, how would you classify the reasons given for hatred of the Jews? Now, the first is Jews are different. This is number 1, Jews are different. And this is what Jonathan Sachs has written about, that in general, human beings, we are tribal. We are tribal by nature. That's just, any anthropologist, psychologist, we are a tribal species, just like any other mammal animal. And the tribe emphasizes sameness, it's just, some of it's natural. Jews were often minorities, not throughout not all of our history, but much of our history, we have been different. Just like I was talking about people wearing a yarmulke. That is not something that most people do. Most people do not wear a head covering. Most people do not have huge beards or side locks. Most people don't follow, kosher laws. So Jews were different, and difference has always been a source of persecution. So that's one overarching explanation. Now, what's interesting about this explanation is that, that's not unique to Jews. There are a lot of minorities who are different, who are persecuted. So being different is not such a distinguishing factor for Jews. Although, interestingly, Jews have been different over many different time periods and places. The Jews have been a minority in Europe, in America, in parts of North Africa. So that's first, Jews are different. The second explanation, and this is that Jews killed Jesus, that's the charge, obviously. But I think this is a broader issue. The role of Jews in Christianity. And then we talked a little bit about this last week, but I want to expand on it a little bit more. Jews were always seen as inferior, lesser, in some senses demonic within traditional Christianity. I was doing a little research, and there's sort of 4. So the overall explanation is Jews are different within Christianity. Jews are the other. And that took several different forms. First is Jews were often seen as devilish. I mean, even the gospel, going back really the 4th century of the Common Era, influential figures in Christian theology have associated with Jews with the devil or with demonic elements. During the Middle Ages, Jews were frequently described as children of the devil, often portrayed in Christian art with horns and bulging eyes and associated with satanic attributes such as arrogance and devious logic. That's for sure. Similar depictions of Jews can be seen in Muslim texts from the 20th century onward. Yeah, that's another interesting phenomenon of anti-Semitism. A lot of the medieval Christian views of Jews have kind of been grafted on to 20th century sort of radical Islam. which is even the blood libel, the idea that Jews use the blood of Christian children to make matzah. I remember writing about this in the book, that is actually a Hamas spokesman made that same charge. So you see some of these same themes, motifs. So Jews as demonic. A second is the idea of ritual slaughter. I just talked about this, and it's not only using the blood of Christian children for Passover. There are even charges throughout history of Jews sacrificing, in some ways. Again, this goes back to this sort of demonic element of sacrificing Christian children to satiate, their sort of terrible appetites. I mean, this horrible stuff. And the third element of this kind of Jews as secondary citizens in Christianity is the motif of the wandering Jew. You've probably heard that term, wandering Jew, before. And this goes back that Augustine, who I talked about a little bit last week, Augustine said that Jews were a cursed people doomed to wander in misery until the end of days, as testament of their own depravity and Christian superiority. The wandering Jew later developed as a wretched, lowly figure of Christian folklore, circulating as a well-known European legend beginning in the 13th century. In the traditional formulation, a Jew who taunted Jesus on the way to his crucifixion is cursed to roam the earth until the end of days. In some versions, the Jew is cursed not only to roam the earth, but also to remain in an evil state as punishment for his persecution of Jesus, his taunting of Jesus on his way to the crucifixion, his crucifixion of Jesus, and his rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. Today, this myth echoes in efforts to reinforce the supposedly lowly status of diasporic Jews, for example, in student-led Kick a Jew or Hit a Jew events held at some places even today. Similarly, it can be seen in the notion that Jews, alone among the peoples of the earth, can never merit statehood. This view is expressed in efforts to delegitimize the state of Israel and is reflected in terms like the Zionist entity as a disparaging synonym for the Jewish state. So essentially, what this idea suggests is that the whole idea, this Christian motif of Jews as a wandering people, is used today to say Jews should not have a homeland, should not have a state, that essentially it underpins the anti-Zionist argument. So first, Jews are different. Second, Jews killed Jesus. Third kind of motif and explanation that we often hear for anti-Semitism is that Jews are greedy. Jews are greedy. Now, this in some ways goes back to the idea of satanic attributes, devilish attributes, Jews kind of devious and clever and manipulative. But this, obviously, this still exists in the world today. You sometimes still hear people say, he Jewed me down, right? Now, where does this attribute come from? I mean, some of it comes from the Gospels, where Jews are depicted as the money changers, the money changers in the temple, who performed actually a very important role. The money changers were what allowed people to offer sacrifices. There were different denominations and people had to give, so you exchanged money just like people do today. But this idea of Jews as greedy has some echoes from the Gospels. Really also goes back to the Middle Ages, where I think I talked about this last week or the week before that Jews were bankers, or at least money lenders, in many medieval towns because Christians couldn't do it legally. The Catholic Church forbid it. And yet, there always has to be some function of lending in an economy. An economy needs lending or else it can't grow, it's stagnant. And Jews performed that function. Jews were also literate in a time when where most people in the world were illiterate. Jews, at least male Jews, because it was part of the requirement of education, could read and write contracts. And so because Jews were often serving in that kind of role of writing and enforcing contracts, they were charged with being greedy. And then it became even more prominent in the modern era, where this is actually a phenomenon that other cultures experience as well. It's called the minority middleman. And this is the idea that certain privileged groups in society, so let's go back to European aristocrats, these feudal lords in Poland, they needed someone to collect their money from the serfs. And they didn't want it to do it themselves because, the serfs could rise up and attack them. So Jews served as essentially the functionaries that their Jew status was so fragile that if they weren't feudal lords, but they also weren't peasants. They were the middle, and they were minorities. They were different than both. So they could kind of serve in a positive sense, could serve as a bridge, but in a negative sense, they needed the protection of the feudal lords. So the feudal lords could say, you go collect the money that I'm owed. And so Jews kind of, this is the court Jew example as well, that Jews served as bankers for feudal princes, so that it essentially insulated the aristocrats and persecuted the population and put Jews in this vulnerable position. And so this recurred throughout history. This is sort of one of and this is all linked together. The fact that Jews were not Christian and that Jews were different made them different than the entire population. And so they could serve in this role. They were both outsiders, but also insiders. It's someone had to do it. Someone had to be the collector. And in some ways it made Jewish life bearable. Jews could live. It was a job, but it also was a very vulnerable job. Jews could easily be attacked when in difficult times there was an instant victim. So that's the third. Jews were greedy. Fourth, we can take some questions now and comments until we go to the next one. Who's got questions and comments about this? Sarah, then Gil.
The tie between Christianity and anti-Semitism can also be shown on the flip side in countries that are not Christian. In Asian countries, there's very little anti-Semitism. And at least from Chinese friends of mine that have told me, Jews are not known well in China, but admired. And they're admired for being good with money, and that's taken as a positive attribute. In fact, there's even books in China, How to Make Money Like a Jew, which is like a positive thing, because the Chinese are also quite money-minded, and they admire this skill in Jewish people, they think exists. They also think Jews are very good musicians because a lot of the exposure they got to Jews were seeing famous Jewish musicians. So there's actually like positive stereotypes, and Jews are intelligent. That's another stereotype of Jews in Asian countries. So Jews are not well known, but there's really not much anti-Semitism, and the Jews, what's known about the Jews is somewhat positive.
Oh, sure. That's a more modern kind of phenomenon, especially within China. There are positive attributes to this for certain. In general, making money is a good thing. America was built in that sense. So in many ways, that's why America, it has been a very happy place for Jews, mostly. Of course, there's some anti-Semitic incidents and so forth, but, capitalism is very good for Jews generally. There's no doubt about it. You just look at history. It's when things get overboard. And it's interesting, China is fairly, Jews sort of had this mythological status. Japan has actually had a history of anti-Semitism, even though there are virtually no Jews who live in Japan, which is a very strange thing. There's literally very, very few Jews and those who do are generally expats, but there's books about Japanese anti-Semitism, which I don't
Really?
quite understand it. Neil makes an important point. Absolutely, most Jews were not money lenders, but yes, 99% of Jews were very poor subsistence farmers. Most Jews were poor. It was a very small group, but that extended. What happened is generally stereotypes exist in the population, and then in America, Jews did ascend the class structure. That was a huge. There's Jews were essentially one generation working class people. Again, not all. I'm making a fairly generalized statement, but in general, Jews who came over in the early 20th century and lived on the Lower East Side or on Maxwell Street, their children became attorneys or doctors and so forth. There was certainly a leap in class stature. Okay, Gil.
The Jews also, during the time of collecting, when they were collecting for lords, Jews were also set up as minters for
Sure.
the various governments. They would mint the coins for the country, like Poland, and those coins. Some of those coins have secret Jewish symbols in there, so that you know that it's a Jewish minter.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. I didn't know that part, but it makes sense. At that point, countries issued their own currency, and different, feudal lords would have currencies depending on the region in which, there was no, universal euro or dollar at that point. That makes sense. That makes sense. Good. Okay. Marilyn.
Talking about last week about how many Christian nations there are and Muslim nations, and we're just one little tiny country. So we are such a minority. And even though Jews were scattered all over the world, we didn't have empires. We didn't create empires like some of the other nations did. And so we've lasted, it all started with Abraham and Sarah, and then the journey with Moses. And so we've been at this for over 3,000 years.
Right.
So the fact that we are a minority and always have been a minority, and was it Hadrian who called it Palestine?
No one actually knows when the word Palestine came into existence. But what you make a very good point that Jews were never empire builders. Very briefly, actually, the Maccabees were. The Maccabees, the Maccabees tried to conquer surrounding areas, and they extended. The Maccabees encouraged people to convert to Judaism, but the Maccabees didn't last very long. They quickly became corrupt themselves. But aside from the Maccabees, Jews have never really been empire builders, and that's probably a good thing, because empires inevitably fall. They overextend themselves. We've seen that throughout history. And so the fact that Jews were a dispersed people, we lived all over the world, and both assimilated and maintain our distinctiveness. That's a very interesting, complex cultural phenomenon, that Jews both integrated to the larger population. If you've ever been to Spain or even Curacao, you see the names on the walls of synagogues, and they're Spanish sounding names. They sound just like a normal Spaniard, and yet these were synagogues. These were Jewish families that maintained a commitment to Jewish life. So they both assimilated to a degree, but also maintained their distinctiveness to a degree. Some more than others, that some fully assimilated, some never assimilated at all, but it's a very complex phenomenon to be both an insider and an outsider. And obviously that continues today. That's part of the challenge of American Jewish life now, even, for first generation of Jews who came over generally wanted to assimilate as much as possible. Now Jews are pretty assimilated, so we want to try to be a little more distinct. You know, it's an ongoing challenge, and it's affected by many other factors as well. As you know, intermarriage, the existence of Israel. I mean, all of that shapes how we live as a people. Some would argue, this is sort of a counter, some would argue that anti-Semitism is actually good for Jewish identity. You know, that when somebody hates you, you know, it's easy to maintain your distinctiveness, you know, that you say, well, anti-Semitism can bring Jews together. It's certainly good for fundraising for certain organizations. You know, that if things seem bad for Jews, I mean, like the ADL's giving has skyrocketed the last few years, in part because of an increase in anti-Semitism. And so in some ways, anti-Semitism, I would never say it's a positive, but at least reinforces certain aspects of Jewish identity. I would say overall, its negatives outweigh its positives, but it's important to understand that. Okay. Other questions about this? Okay, but let's go on. And then, so the fourth kind of overall justification for anti-Semitism, and of course, these are all related, but is that Jews are an inferior nation, an inferior nationality, an inferior group. This was sort of the, obviously in Nazism and the Holocaust, that Jews were non-Aryan. They had, big noses and are just generally not as prominent and successful a people as other, European nationalities, which is also, in some ways, a lot of these justifications for anti-Semitism contradict each other. There's no logic here. Because the same people would charge, well, Jews are devilishly intelligent and steal from people. So, Jews are both inferior and superior. And the two could coexist. Someone would say the same, one person could say both of them. But the idea is that Jews are simply not as courageous, not as brave, and successful and driven as other nations. And by the way, this actually, some Jews believed this as well. Some Jews believe this about themselves. There's a very famous poem written by, it's not Bialik, it was an earlier Israeli poet. And it was called The City of Slaughter. And it was essentially a poem about a pogrom in which the Jewish men hid behind the walls while Jewish women were raped by Polish soldiers. This was a theme of the poem. It's an awful poem. I mean, it's a beautiful poem, but awful in its content.
It was by Bialik.
Yeah, it is Bialik. Okay. So the idea was that Jews had been corrupted by the ghetto, that we became a weak people. And that was part of the call of Zionism, was to return to the land, a muscular Zionism. And so in some ways, early Zionists accepted some of the anti-Semitic canards of anti-Semites. And that's been well documented. There are several books written about this. But this idea that Jews were corrupted by Judaism, that we became too intellectual in some ways, too in our heads rather than our hearts or our bodies. So this has been a very prominent charge. And some Israelis actually think that about ultra-Orthodox today, that, they're some of the same kind of what we would call anti-Semitism, if it's, if it's put towards the Jewish people as a whole, sometimes exists within the Jewish people themselves. So this idea of the inferior race or nationality or culture.
That poem is called.
The fifth justification, The fifth reason is the idea that Jew, and this is very modern, is that Jews are Western imperialists. This is what's heard. This is why the United Nations generally hates Israel, is that Israel is seen as a Western imperial power that exists in the less developed Middle East, that we are a Western European people that have colonized Eastern, indigenous peoples. This charge really, I mean, one of the foremost kind of proponents of it was a Palestinian named Edward Said, who taught at Columbia University, and wrote a book essentially about Western imperialism and made the argument that Israel is a Western imperial state. This is the idea that the West is violent, it is genocidal, it has committed mass murders in Africa and stolen the treasure, stolen diamonds and gold from Africa to bring to the West. And this charge loops Jews into that same group of Western imperialists. That this, by the way, is very prominent on college campuses. It sort of essentially pits the world as a clash of civilizations. And the West is the evil, powerful, aggressive civilization. And Jews are essentially exemplify those qualities, which is kind of ironic because most, Christianity shaped the West and Christianity was anti-Semitic. So essentially, it's saying Jews are the exemplars of an anti-Semitic civilization, which makes no sense, but it makes sense in the logic of today, which sees Jews as kind of connected to the West. And this actually brings us to Israel, which we're going to get to in a minute. But questions about this? So the big five. So we have Jews are different. Jews killed Jesus. Jews are greedy. Jews are an inferior race, and Jews are Western imperialists. These are all major charges that help explain anti-Semitism over the centuries. Any questions? Okay. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that the propagation of Jewish culture succeeded because it became very decentralized with Rabbinic Judaism. So no matter where the Jews were, they could maintain a certain degree of their cultural specialness or their own culture. And now the diaspora is being taken as a terminology for other groups. I've heard of African Americans described as the African diaspora. I've heard of other groups, other groups in the US being called the diaspora from their home country. And I think that's based on the Jews.
Yeah, that's a good point. The notion of a diaspora. I mean, that certainly Jews have been a diaspora people through most of our history. I mean, even today, more Jews live outside the land of Israel than live in the land of Israel. It's slowly shifting. Already now, Israel does have more Jews, and there are more Jews living in Israel than live in the United States. This just changed over the last few years. But if you count other countries like Australia, France, there are still more Jews who live outside the land of Israel than in. And that's essentially been true throughout history. Even when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans, by that point, more Jews lived outside of the land of Israel than lived in the land of Israel. That probably saved Judaism, if you think about it. If Jews had only lived in Israel, there would be no Judaism left today. So essentially, the fact that we are decentralized, I like that word. Decentralized is a very good word. Although in some ways we are becoming more centralized because now there are essentially two major Jewish population centers, America and Israel. Yeah, Scott?
I was going to say that the first diaspora was the Greeks, which is where the word comes from.
Yeah, That's
They're
right.
the ones who spread all over the world first.
Right. And it was a positive, Greek Hellenistic culture spread all over from the diaspora. And it's interesting, in Israel, there's a major debate over what do you call the diaspora? In some, it would be called, I'm blanking on the Hebrew word now, tifutza, I think is the Hebrew word. There's a museum called the Museum of the Diaspora, and it's Beit HaTifutza, which is essentially
Hatfut-
something that spreads across the world.
Hatfutso.
Tifutza, yeah. But the other word used to describe the diaspora in Israel in Hebrew is galut, which means exile. So there's two different views of what the diaspora is. From a traditional Zionist point of view, if you don't live in the land of Israel, you are in exile. You are essentially lesser, in a existential sense. It's that you are not at the peak of where you could be living. Whereas tifutza is a more neutral word, that the diaspora it exists, it's part of who we are, and it's neither better or less than. So these are two different ideas, and there are still, I think most Jews today still give some sort of special stature to Israel. Certainly within the Orthodox community, it is considered better if you live in the land of Israel. It's a step up. But even many, non-Orthodox Jews would say, well, Israel, the Jewish life in Israel has a special quality to it that you can't get elsewhere. And maybe that's true. But American Jews, we have our own unique culture as well. We've developed certain attributes of, certainly American Judaism is much more egalitarian than Jewish life in Israel. I mean, Israel is a fairly, a different kind of culture, I think, than American Judaism is. So we have our own unique attributes, which is interesting. Okay, other questions about this?
So the Beit Futsot the museum is now called Anu. And I'll put the link in the chat. And I once heard, so that means us together. So they're changing their branding, and it's much more interactive. And that's another whole story. But
Great museum, yeah.
yeah, I heard Raquel Corazine, and she was the educator at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Israel. And she was talking to a bunch of Israelis, and she said, what do you call the diaspora? Galut. Galut is bad. Out of Israel is bad. She goes, but where do you go on vacation? Chutz la'aretz, out of the country. Where do you buy all your clothes? Chutz la'aretz. And even in their teaching, chutz la'aretz is fun and good. Galut, that's bad. But you don't want to be caught there.
It's very interesting. Right. Yeah. I mean, Israel is certainly a more, culturally, Israel is a much more nationalist culture than America is. Partly that certainly probably has to do with military service, which is, mandatory for most Israelis. And so there is a kind of stronger national identity in Israel than even in America, especially among, American Jews. It wasn't always the case. In the 19th century, many American Jews said, Washington, D.C. is our Jerusalem. Some even said Charleston, South Carolina is our Jerusalem. But there's an interesting history. Now I want to go, I was trying to think through to kind of crystallize, why is anti-Semitism on the rise in America today? We can talk a little bit more about the rest of the world as well. But I was trying to sort of crystallize, what is it that's causing this surge? So we just looked at the 5 different factors that have explained anti-Semitism in history. But what specifically is happening now that American Jews, feel much more at risk, even than 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago? I mean, it's really changed. So I would say one and I've talked a little bit about this already, is politics. That Jews tend to fare better when there is more consensus, when a society is less divisive. Everyone here knows that we live in a very divisive political time right now, where so many issues are political, and few things unite Americans. And so when there are divisive times, people lash out. They look for victims. They look for scapegoats to explain the division. And Jews are often targeted in that. And Jews make a convenient target for both sides. So for the extreme left, Jews are, capitalist, rich, white people. That's the extreme left. For the extreme right, Jews are, bankers and Hollywood pulling the strings of all the world and persecuting. They're allowing immigrants to come into the country and polluting our pure and wonderful America. So you've got this awful extremes on both sides. And so the fact that we live in a time of great political division, it helps explain a rise in anti-Semitism. The second factor, and I talked a little bit about this as well before, is Israel and the role that Israel plays. I was reading this article, as I was researching for today, I came back to an article that I found, which was quite interesting. And it was a panel on racism and anti-Semitism. And at this panel, which was held at Bard College, Students for Justice in Palestine came to a panel on anti-Semitism. So this was a panel not on Israel, not on racism, but on anti-Semitism, and protested at a panel on anti-Semitism and said Jews were persecuting Palestinians. And the people one person on the panel, the Jewish representative of the panel, said, "Come to the panel tomorrow where we're talking about Zionism." And they said, "No, don't you see that the fact that you are Jewish means that you are racist, because the entire ethnicity, anyone who is connected in any way to Israel, is racist." So what this person said, one of the protesters, is that the conversation about anti-Semitism is inherently about Israel, which seems, it doesn't make any sense unless a person groups all of Jews together and said, if you are Jewish, you automatically hate all Palestinians and want to commit genocide against them. But what makes it even worse is that one of the people on the panel encouraged the protesters. So this is a professor, Shahana McKinney Baldone, who was invited to talk about racism and anti-Semitism and encouraged protesters who were saying that anyone Jewish is guilty of genocide against Palestinians. So Israel becomes this flashpoint for any kind of, it's hard to separate a rational discussion of anti-Semitism with the political life in Israel. So that's the second reason. A third reason, which is in some ways very different, but it is important, is assimilation. That many people, as I said at the beginning, 90% of Jews perceive that there's a rise in anti-Semitism, but only 60% of the larger population. As Jews become more assimilated and less attuned to Judaism, in some ways, that can reduce anti-Semitism, but it can also increase anti-Semitism because people don't, in some ways, there is a lack of knowledge and pride in Jewish culture, and there's a loss of any kind of defense and explanation of Judaism. And so in some ways, when you know nothing about Judaism, it's easier to just do nothing. When people speak out, it's easier to ignore Israel. It's easy to be embarrassed by Israel. We certainly know Jews who, they maybe feel like, oh, I'm embarrassed by Jews who are very pro-Israel, or embarrassed by Jews who are very observant. I certainly know people like that, good people, generally good people, but in some ways, any lack of commitment to Judaism in some ways can make you feel embarrassed at a strong commitment to Judaism. So this is and that can further anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that there's nothing to criticize. Of course, there's lots of things to criticize. I'll criticize Israel. I'll criticize the Orthodox. No problem there. But when it becomes criticism because of ignorance and indifference, that's a different kind of criticism than criticism out of shared values. Okay, comments.
Marilyn and then Susan.
When you were talking, Rabbi, about the political situation, I think that the way the world is now, with the instability that we all are suffering, I think that's a perfect mecca for creating scapegoats, because it just sets it up so that we are all feeling and as we hear the news, as you say, and discussions, that instability is greater now than I can ever remember in my entire life.
Yeah, I mean, this is another theme throughout history, that in general, in better, stable, more prosperous times, Jewish life is much better. I mean, think about, the Depression was an awful time for Jews. Weimar Germany, was an awful time for Jews. When societies become more divided, there's people look for scapegoats. This is Rene Girard, the philosopher I talked a little bit about in one of my High Holy Day sermons. Talked a lot about this, that societies need scapegoats, and Jews have been that scapegoat. Okay, Sue, then Ellen, then Marcia, then Pam.
Okay, you had asked the question about what did we think was causing the rise of anti-Semitism in this country. And I have recently read, and don't ask me where I read it because I can't remember, but one of the things is that Jews are perceived as having divided loyalties, that we can't, between America and Israel. They feel that American Jews aren't 100% American, that we have a problem with the divided loyalties. I don't think that's necessarily true, but this is a perception that other people have. The other thing is that for such a small community as we are in this world, and in this country, we're such a tiny percentage of the population, we have way too much influence. And people are jealous of that. They feel that how is it that we can have so much influence when there's so few of us? And I mean, just read the list of all the people who've won Nobel Prizes, and people in the government, and people, I mean, in all walks of life, there are so many Jews. And they think we're all rich, which of course we know very well that we're not.
Right.
There are a lot of very poor Jews.
No question. That's a great point. I think the divided loyalties that still exists. It was much more prominent even 50 years ago, especially when Israel was in formation. Now, in general, the interesting thing is most Americans generally have a positive view towards Israel. They may not like Netanyahu, they may not like certain parts of it, but in general, but I think your point about a disproportionate influence is certainly true. And you hear actually that from both the right and the left. On the left, you hear people say, well, we can be critical of so many things. Why can't we be critical of Israel? Or why can't we be critical of Jews? Are Jews so special that we can't be critical? So there's in that, and they would say, well, yeah, because, Jews they run everything. So you hear that from the left, and then you hear it from the right. You hear, Pat Buchanan said Congress is Israeli occupied territory. Even Trump in a recent interview I mean, it was, I just read this that said, Congress was controlled by Jews. And then he said, well, that's actually, no, he said Congress was controlled by Israel. And then Trump said, well, that's a good thing. Now it's not. But he was essentially making the charge that anti-Semites do and tried to put a positive spin on it. But, certainly this idea exists on the right and the left. Ellen. Go ahead, Ellen. Unmute.
You need to unmute.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah.
I think something Rabbi just said and that Susan said too, when you pose the question of, it seems difficult for us as Americans to sometimes understand why this rises and where is it coming from. I think as American Jews, particularly, from secure, stable, affluent American families that have been here a long time, we view ourselves as Americans. Our families have been here for generations. There have been Jews in America since before there was a United States of America. We look at ourselves as Americans. In my family, we always said that Israel was the Holy Land, but America is the Promised Land. So sometimes I think it shocks us to see how other people who are not Jews view us as a people who have divided loyalties, because we don't see that being questioned of our American Catholic friends or our American Baptist friends or Episcopalian friends. But somehow as Jews from the outside, it's always wondered, are you American Jews or Jewish Americans? What are you? And to us as Americans, we view ourselves as the same, just as good as we're as American as anybody else. And I think that's a very unique thing in history. In the history of Europe, in the history of the Middle East, in the history of the world, Jews were the outsiders, the others. But as Americans, we look at ourselves and say, we're Americans. We're just like anybody else. But I don't know that always people who are not Jewish view us as that way. And sometimes I think that surprises us.
It's a great point. And I think you're right. I mean, there certainly has been anti-Semitism in American history. I mean, just think, even on the North Shore of Chicago, think about, Kenilworth versus Highland Park, but even so, in general, America was not established with a existing order. Every European country was a Christian country. America was, there were Christians who were founded it, but there was no official church. There was no national church in America ever. And so even in essentially everyone was an outsider and everyone was an insider. And I think you're right. I think most American Jews think of themselves as American 100%. And Israel's a part of that. But not one's nationality. Great point. Okay, Marcia.
I just wanted to share this because it was so blatant. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised or upset anymore, but these school board meetings and how, people have become lunatics. They're afraid their kids are going to learn history and they're afraid. Well, this was a bunch of anti-vaxxers and anti-mandates. And one woman, I read this, I can't remember the city or the state it was in, but there couldn't be one where there are a lot of Jews. She gets up and she goes, I blame the Jews. The Jews own all the pharmaceutical companies and it's their fault. And so I blame all of this pushing of the vaccine on the Jews. And this was even more disturbing, was the president of the school board or whoever was leading the meeting, instead of saying to her, this anti-Semitic hate speech is not acceptable under any circumstances, what he said to her was, tell me something I can do something about. I can't do anything about that. That was even—
What an awful response.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of much anti-Semitism among the anti-vaxxer movement. I mean, certainly these fringe movements always have some element of anti-Semitism. But I hadn't heard that. That's an interesting story. Not terribly surprising, but again, part of the interesting phenomenon about Jews is we do display certain, we, as Susan mentioned, there is this charge of Jews having disproportionate influence, but in some ways that is actually true. Like, I don't want to say that it's not. Jews do. I mean, for a period of time, I don't think it's true anymore, but for a period of time, about 50% of all the money raised by the Democratic Party in the United States came from Jews. 50, that's huge. If we're 1-2% of the population, but give 50% of the donations to one political party, that is disproportionate influence. Now, it's part of the free market system. This is our system. The gun lobbyists have disproportionate influence too. Evangelical Christians have lots of groups have disproportionate influence. It's not just Jews. So by admitting, I don't want to say even admitting it, because that implies that there's something wrong with it. By acknowledging that, it's not saying that it's bad. It exists as it is. And we do happen to be disproportionately successful, but not the most, by the way. Hindus are the most, Hindu doctors, but Jews do display certain unique characteristics. We generally tend to live in urban areas. This is a major factor that, and we tend to live in states that are swing states. So Jews do in some ways have disproportionate influence on elections because a lot of Jews live in Florida. We know that. So Florida is always this perennial swing state. A lot of Jews live in Philadelphia and the Philadelphia suburbs. Pennsylvania is a swing state often. So in many ways, Jews do have some disproportionate influence, but it's not out of some nefarious plot. It's simply out of how politics aligns in America. You could say that rural voters in America have disproportionate influence. I mean, that's without question. I mean, Wyoming and California have the same number of senators, and Wyoming is tiny. So, lots of groups in America have disproportionate influence. Okay, good. Okay, Sarah, and then we'll conclude.
I just have two brief comments. In this discussion about what should be taught in the schools, I heard one comment saying, if you're going to teach about the Holocaust, you have to teach the opposing view.
Yeah, that was a controversy in Texas.
Yeah.
That happened where.
So what the heck is the opposing view?
There is no
of the
such thing.
Holocaust?
There is no such thing.
And
I think that was sort of a, there's overreactions, and I think that we're seeing some of that now, that there are people that are saying, well, we don't like the history that's being taught, so we need to teach a different history, and the different history is over the top too. I mean, I think that there are certainly legitimate, as someone who studies history and studied history, I do think that in some ways, the study of history is a lot different now than it was 20 years ago. And there are some negatives to that. And I don't know what's taught in schools and all over the country. I certainly don't know, but history is always taught with a certain kind of bias. There's no such thing as an unbiased. So maybe the pendulum should swing a little bit back towards the center, but on an issue like the Holocaust, there is no alternative viewpoint. That's makes no sense. Okay, Ellen, final comment, and then we'll conclude.
I had one other thing, which is social media.
Pam also had her hand
Oh,
up.
Pam, we didn't get to Pam.
Pamela.
So, quick, Pam, go.
Pamela.
So,
Pamela.
Pamela.
What about the rise of anti-Semitic behavior, what I think is very interesting with the youth, and it's actually kind of what you were saying, Rabbi, I think the lack of knowledge about history, I don't think that people understand the root of Israel, and yet and people say, Western, influence in the Middle East or whatever, but people are forgetting about the history and, why Israel is there. And it's so easy to point your finger and say Israel is, they're not treating the Palestinians correctly or whatever. But if you look at the root, of why Israel's there, I think that people are forgetting and it's just easy to blame. And I think that our youth today, 1947 wasn't that long ago for us, but I just don't think there's the historical precedent and people are angry about Israel.
100% right. That the story of Israel has kind of been lost. And some of that is inevitable. As we advance in time, we lose some of the immediate experience of the moment. If you didn't grow up in if you didn't experience the 6-Day War, it's hard to imagine what it would be like for Israel to be threatened. If your childhood, if your memories of childhood in Israel is the Intifada, it's a different experience than, the 6-Day War. And so one's personal experience in life does change how you view a situation. At the same time, I do think that a lot of that story of Israel has been lost, that people aren't learning it. That's what I gave a sermon about this like 10 years ago. I remember I should find a copy of that. It was a good one. I said that, forget about all the political divisions, which are fine. If you don't have a shared story, if people don't know that story, it's inevitable. I mean, the same thing's kind of happening in the United States. We are losing a shared story, a kind of narrative. And of course, the narrative is always, no narrative is perfect. Narratives are stories. They're not sets of facts. So some people will feel excluded. There's no, and the truth is, the narrative story of Israel does exclude Arabs. There's problems with the narrative. There's no question about it. No, the narrative isn't perfect, but at least it had some sense of cohesion. And I think as you lose that narrative, you lead to more divisions. Okay, we are over time. It is wonderful to see everybody, and we'll continue this next week.
Right.
And if you want to hear more about the narrative, this Sunday, Danny Spungen is going to talk about why Shanghai, understanding the 5,000-mile journey for refuge through artifacts and testimony. So come, it's 10 a.m. If the link is in Macomb at Home. And if you need anything else, please just let me know. Good to see everybody.
Thank you.